Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to welcome each of you to yet another potentially scintillating Sunday webinar. And the topic for today are why are smart people stupid? And I'm looking at the chat and Caroline is letting us know that she's going to be taking a walk while she's listening to the webinar. And I think that's a pretty smart way to get the best of both worlds, to be able to enjoy the outdoors while also being present during the webinar. Thank you for sharing that. Caroline, I think that's a pretty smart thing to do. It's sometimes called opportunity dueling or time dueling, where you're able to get two things accomplished that are meaningful to you in the same window of opportunity. So folks, good afternoon and welcome back. It means a lot to me that you've hopped on this call despite the enticing weather outside. So thank you all for joining us. As I said, it is why are smart people stupid? And I would dare say that almost everyone on this Zoom call has probably wondered about this question sometime or the other. You've surely had this moment where you have had to encounter this question. But one of the interesting things is that most of us probably have wondered this about other people, and perhaps less frequently when we've been willing to ask this question of ourselves. And that is a challenge. I want to also take a moment to celebrate a book called Orbiting the Giant Hairball, written by Gordon McKinsey. Now, Gordon McKinsey was a designer with Hallmark, and he worked in Hallmark, which was a major bureaucracy. As you can see, there would be a clash of the orientation of an artist with the orientation of a business. And he wrote this book where he explores many aspects of how do we preserve our creative genius, our creative spark, our creative intelligence, even while we are enmeshed in bureaucracies that seem to, celebrate standardization and efficiency over creativity. And he talks about a age-old assault on the creative genius of mankind that has been there historically. Think of all the super smart, super intelligent people that actually were suppressed and persecuted because the things that they had to offer seemed far beyond their times and far too threatening. It's also important at the beginning of this discussion to understand and remember that there's a fundamental difference between knowledge and wisdom, right? Knowledge, so you have people who are lacking sometimes in both knowledge and wisdom. And then you have some people who are blessed with both knowledge and wisdom. But of course, there are people who are very deep in terms of wisdom, but might not be knowledgeable at all. We've all met people who meet that dimension. And there are others who are perhaps extremely knowledgeable, but lacking in wisdom. So it's very important to keep in mind that there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom, with knowledge being more like how much information have you hoarded, and wisdom being your creative ability to make decisions that truly honor, the multiple elements in any situation. It's also important to remember, for example, let me break it down in simpler terms. Knowledge is about, do I have the skills to climb the ladder? There is this ladder that we are trying to climb in society in terms of our status. Do I have the skills to climb the corporate ladder? Would be knowledge. And with, competency. Wisdom would be, do I have the ability to understand if this ladder is leaning against the right wall? Because too often we climb ladders that were leaning against the wrong wall, and by the time you discover it's way too late. So as Osho reminds us, ladders can be used for both purposes. They can go up and they can go down. Only the direction is different, and intelligence is a similar attribute. It's like a ladder. You can go up or you can bring yourself down based upon a host of different situations. It's also important to remember that what we value as intelligence and what we consider as intelligence is highly dependent upon a worldview. Many of us are familiar with the distinction between being-oriented cultures, where the whole purpose of life is seen as the joy of being, perhaps being with nature, being with your family, versus the doing-oriented cultures that tend to instill more ambition, where you're supposed to be doing something. Many of you may have encountered the parable of Alexander the Great, the emperor who was out to conquer the whole world. He was on this relentless mission of conquering the whole world. He traveled the whole world, and then he runs into this mystic called Diogenes. And this mystic called Diogenes is by the banks of a river. I forget which river. And Alexander asks him, what the hell are you doing? I've been looking at you for the last half an hour. You're just lying on the bank of the river sunbathing yourself? What are you accomplishing? And Diogenes says, I'm just experiencing existence. I'm experiencing life. And Diogenes asks him the same question. He asks Alexander, what are you doing? He says, I'm conquering the whole world. I'm on a rampage. I'm going to go from country to country and conquer the whole world. It's interesting that when Diogenes started laughing, he said, what a useless thing you're doing. What are you going to do after you have conquered the whole world? What is going to be the purpose of your life? And that's the point it is said when Alexander was really flummoxed, because he recognized that once he conquers the whole world, he's going to fall into the same abyss of emptiness, the abyss of nothingness. And this is a parable that's often told to show how Alexander's laughing at Diogenes' stupidity of squandering away his life, and Diogenes' laughing at Alexander's relentless ambition, where he'll be running for the whole of his life without a sense of having reached or gotten anywhere. I also want to make a brief reference to a Harvard Business Review article that some of you might be interested to read. The article is by Chris Argyris, and it's called Teaching Smart People How to Learn. Isn't that an interesting irony that there should be an article about teaching smart people how to learn? Well, simply because, as the author points out, many smart people have a history of successes, going from one success to the other. So they become failure avoidant. They're afraid of failure because that's not something that they experience too often. Another thing that smartness often produces is an inflated ego, because when you are smart or you see yourself as smart, you've had many perceived successes that have continued to strengthen your ego. And then it's that very ego, when it becomes inflated, creates a forms of blindness and leads you into situations where you might do pretty stupid things. And there's also the recognition that too much knowledge can be a barrier. There's the parable of the Zen master. A professor from university, he visits him and says, look, I want to become really wise. So the Zen master goes in and brings out a cup and gives it to him and say, first sit down and have some tea. And he brings a pot of tea and he starts pouring it into the cup of the Zen master. The tea starts overflowing. He doesn't stop. Into the cup of the professor. So the professor is holding a cup. The Zen master is pouring the tea. The cup is full, but the Zen master doesn't stop. The tea is overflowing. And the professor is saying, what the hell are you doing? My cup is full. Why are you filling it? And it's that Zen moment of awakening when the Zen master says, this is exactly the problem with you. Your mind is so full of knowledge that there's really no room for you to see anything differently, for you to see or experience wisdom. First, empty your cup before you talk to me, because otherwise you're likely to be so complacent, with the sense of knowing everything. So too much knowledge can actually be a barrier. Usually my Sunday webinars, I tend to celebrate one or the other of Osho's books or chapters. So the book that I read for this week's webinar, from where I will try to bring out some interesting points, is called Intelligence by Osho. As I had mentioned, Osho has left behind a legacy of over 2,000 books, and we occasionally dip into those to try to celebrate some of the insights. It's called The Creative Response to Now. Why is it called The Creative Response to Now? Because the book, in the beginning chapter, differentiates between intellect and knowing. Intelligence is about the faculty of knowing. Intellect is about absorbing knowledge. Now, when you absorb knowledge, you lose sometimes the ability to be able to respond to a dynamic situation in terms of what the situation needs. You become stupid with a lot of knowledge because you carry a lot of formulaic answers, and you tend to kind of use them compulsively and repetitively instead of being able to develop a novel and fresh response to the situation that is not just given by your past experiences, that is not given by your memory. So interestingly, in order to access a deeper kind of intelligence, memory can be helpful, but there are times when you may have to transcend your memory, renounce your memory, because the memory is going to keep you trapped in the responses of the past. All of us have heard of the metaphor of somebody who's driving down a highway at 70 miles an hour, looking at the rear view mirror. Now, Osho reminds us in this book, and I love this point, that stupidity is not the absence of intelligence. Isn't that interesting? Because he says, think about it, a rock is not stupid. Would you ever think of calling a table or a rock stupid? No, you don't, because those are objects that you don't see as having intelligence. We use the word stupid even when we ignore it to invoke it to demean somebody. When we see somebody who we know is blessed with the potential of intelligence, but doesn't seem to be using it. And it is in that moment of exasperation that we call them stupid, because we say, what's wrong with you? You're not using it. It's important to know what those moments are. Sometimes you will see a person clinging to a kind of immaturity. That happens to me all the time. I'm clinging in my life to various forms of immaturity that people are looking at me saying, can't you see you're being stupid? Get out of the situation. And I'll continue to cling, with a lot of immaturity. Two forms of immaturity or contamination that tend to diminish our intelligence. One is living in the past. We carry the dead weight of the past on us to a tremendous degree. And the dead weight of the past sometimes diminishes our ability to react to the present, to live powerfully in the present. Perhaps we've had painful experiences that we are still carrying. There are many ways in which we shoot ourselves in the foot and we don't live our full potential. Some of us don't take the initiative. We are full of ideas, but perhaps in the past when we took some initiative, we were criticized or condemned, so we withdrew into a shell and became a very passive person, never exercising that initiative. Perhaps we were out there and somebody ridiculed us and we became so defensive and we got into protecting our self-image. There's another Harvard Business Review article called Stop Holding Yourself Back that talks about the many ways in which we fail to live our potential, and these are just two of the ways in which we might shoot ourselves in the foot. And therefore, living in the past is something. What can you do? Well, it is almost an unavoidable cosmic or existential tragedy that human beings face the present by relying on the accumulated experiences of the past. But at least a little bit of freedom and liberation can be gained when we are conscious of the extent to which our experience and perceptions of a present reality are being so clouded by the voices from the past, by the clutter of voices and noises from the past. Another way in which we diminish our intelligence, is Osho, is by living in the future. So when you're living from the past is no more. So, but you're still responding from the past. And where you're projecting into the future is life that has not yet been. So many of us squander away living in daydreams. And that's a form of personal stupidity. The waiting for Godot syndrome. I'll be happy tomorrow. Today sucks, but tomorrow I'll be happy. I'll be happy after I get married. I'll be happy after I have children. I'll be happy after I get promoted. Perhaps I'll be happy after I retire. So we keep postponing, the idea of happiness, and we are living in the future and we have lost touch with the immediacy of the present. So these are some of the ways in which we fail to live up to the potential of the very precious intelligence that we may be given. So I'm going to shift metaphors at this point in the talk. I just got my first vaccine shot of the Pfizer vaccine, and I'm going to be getting the second one on April 7th, I believe. So let's shift our metaphors to vaccinations, and let's talk about vaccinating ourselves to gain protection from the risk of stupidity. So let's imagine stupidity is a virus. How do we vaccinate ourselves to gain protection from that? So I've collected a bunch of ideas from various sources, including from the book on intelligence by Osho, and we will share this, okay? So I have about 25 points. And as you know, I start off these webinars ambitiously with 25 points, and sometimes I barely get to 5 of them, okay? So the first one, as a touchstone, is to remind ourselves that reality is indeed very complex and multi-layered. And often our mind is incapable of apprehending and understanding the true multi-layeredness and complexity of reality. Let me give you a simple example that we have visited before in the webinar series. A simple question: what's the history of the United States? Well, go read a book, take a course. No, the answer isn't that simple. The answer is very complex. We have to say, as Howard Zinn reminds us in People's History of the United States, you have to ask from whose point of view? The history of the United States from the Native Americans' point of view is a totally different story. from the history of the United States from the African Americans' point of view, the history of the United States from the point of view of people who came from different countries in Europe. So always be aware that reality is multi-layered, and the world of appearances and the world of reality could be totally different. How many of you have seen this? That you often compare your insides with somebody else's outsides, and you wonder about how everybody else is so happy, but you're the one who's going through is unhappy, because people put up a happy face. That's the world of appearances, and they appear happy. And then we look at the misery that we are carrying inside, and then we say, how come I'm so unhappy? So while it applies to happiness, it also applies to understanding the history of a society. What appears on the surface to be a simple question could actually give you clues to a very complicated reality. I would propose, based on at least my life experiences, that one of the ultimate intelligence, in a way, is to be so open that we are able to recognize, acknowledge, and embrace the bad news about ourselves, that we can bring a kind of a penetrating insight and a sight to our own lives, that we can see beyond the layers of dust that have accumulated on us, from all the problems that we have faced. And that we are also able to see beyond the carefully crafted self-image that we have. For example, I might have a self-image of myself as a very compassionate person, but if you actually see the way I'm living my life, there might be so many examples where to suggest that I'm not that compassionate person. Too often we have cultivated a self-image and we are falling in love with that self-image. Intelligence is waking up to the possibility that the self-image is a dream, is an illusion, and really to be able to ask around and say, get feedback from others. And sometimes, if we are able to create an environment of such safety that people will feel safe, giving us the bad news about ourselves, even without us going and soliciting it, that's a great freedom, because then you don't have to worry. You know that if you have a blind spot that you're not able to see, somebody cares enough about you, and people feel comfortable enough about you to be able to bring that blind spot to your own attention. I want to give you another point that has worked spectacularly for me. Review those transcendental moments. What do we mean by transcendental moments? We've all had peak moments of different kinds, right? You've had peak moments when you've been happy, peak moments when you've been creative. I want you to focus in on those peak moments in your life, those transcendent moments, when you went from being stupid in a situation suddenly to being super intelligent in that situation. For those of you who have your windows on, just as a test of whether you're awake, how many of you know that if you were to look for those moments, you would probably find plenty of them where you were on the brink of stupidity and you shifted gears and you did something that was smart, right? Raise your hand if you think those situations might exist, right? And therefore, when we examine those situations under a microscope and try to understand what we can learn from them, you get a lot of clues. Let me give you an example in my own life. I was once promoted several times in a year beyond my own level of competence. And there was somebody, one of my colleagues from a totally different department, the head of market research, who saw how incompetent I was at my job, but my bosses could not see that because they only saw my strengths. So I had a colleague of mine who would actually collect all the examples of my incompetence, that were generously littered all over the company. And she would go to the CEO's office and demand that I should be fired. But she was such a person of immense integrity that she would then come to my office and say, I was with the CEO and I was telling him that you should be fired. You're utterly incompetent. Now, that was a moment where I could easily have continued to be stupid and, progressed along that same path, a linear path. But here I was, I literally woke up. I said, you know what? If you can see how incompetent I am, you are the one who should be my coach. So I made her my coach and I said, I want you to give me feedback so I can see how incompetent I am. And I would assiduously and meticulously write down everything she said about me and then go to work on it. And the irony of it all, for 3 consecutive years, I won the Manager of the Year award. And each time I had to receive it, I had to invite her on the stage and say, if it hadn't been for her, that I would never have been receiving this award. Here was a situation where I had the sense to transcend my ego and actually to make someone who perhaps was committed to my extinction in the company, committed to at least extinguishing me. My coach, because I said somebody who doesn't like me, who doesn't believe in me, has a particular perspective on me that can actually carry with it the tremendous potential for redemption in my life. So that's about review the transcendent moments, those moments when you went from abject stupidity to tremendous luminousness and intelligence. All of us have turned situations around in our life, and those situations often will give us many different clues of how to vaccinate ourselves from the virus of stupidity. Another thing that you will see often when you review these moments is that most of us, as Osho reminds us, are gifted with a tremendous capacity to doubt the minds of other people. But you know what? We never doubt our own mind. Notice this. How many of you see that often we doubt other people and how functional their minds are? But when it comes to our own minds, we take the sanity and the undiluted robustness of our own logic and thinking for granted. So deeper intelligence requires two conditions to be present. One of them is we rise above our own proclivity towards uncertainty avoidance. We are all afraid of uncertainty and we run from uncertainty. But this fear of uncertainty often diminishes our intelligence, because a more intelligent response to a situation it requires us to be suspended in uncertainty for a much longer time. The other one is ambiguity intolerance. Just as uncertainty is avoided, we also have an intolerance of ambiguity. It makes us very insecure. It's always easy when you have a roadmap to have the illusion of security. You think you're on a path, you think you know where you're going. Notice that those decisions in life where your destination is unknown are the scariest. For example, being in a relationship is way scarier than space travel. Can somebody tell me why? Somebody want to venture why being in a relationship can actually be scarier than space travel, as I just recently discovered in my own life? Can somebody unmute and throw out an explanation? There's a very simple explanation. You just have to look at my life to know it. Yes, who's this?
Is it vulnerability?
Vulnerability, certainly, but space travel too might require vulnerability, right? If you're going to the moon, you have to be pretty vulnerable.
This is Sumi.
Yes,
can I give a quick comment on that?
Yes.
Because in a relationship, it's another person comes with all the problems that you have, so to say. Whereas in space travel, the other part is materials.
Excellent. That is an excellent answer, one that I had not thought of. So I'm grateful to you for adding to the range of possible answers. And I know Laura has had her hand up. Laura,
I was just thinking that, space travel is heavily tested.
I'm sorry, you need to come a little closer to the mic.
Oh, sure. Sorry. So space travel is just heavily tested, experiments, compliance, regulation. So, there's really less ambiguity there because people aren't scientific, necessarily.
Wow.
Like, you're not going off of data and tests. People can surprise you and be spontaneous. So in a relationship, you really don't know what you're going to get because you haven't run a ton of experiments to predict what can happen.
Excellent. Laura, we were able to hear and understand what you were saying, but just by way of feedback, there's something about the mic that it goes in and out. So just be aware of that, but you were fine. It's an excellent point, one that I had not thought of, and I'm glad I'm asking this question because I had only one answer. And because I'm asking other people, I have three. So see, this is the way in which I have actually reduced my own stupidity from being dependent on one answer to getting many beautiful answers by asking all of you, right? Thank you so much for all of you.
And Param, this is Biman. Before giving your viewpoint, could you please just explain on this very thing that human relationship, as dynamic as it could be for anything in the world, that always changes, whereas space travel is in a certain, is bounded by some sort of certainty. So how do you feel about this uncertainty's infinite boundarylessness?
Yeah, I feel scared shitless, to simply put it colloquially. It scares the crap out of me. You're really right, Biman. You honed in on the answer. So thank you so much for all of you who honed in on the answer. Another way of stating it is, in space travel, the destination is known, the outcome is known. You are headed to the moon, and barring, you know, other breakdowns that can happen. So, you know, it is true that as Bridget said, there is a lot of ambiguity in space travel, and you don't know what's going to happen, right? But at least your destination is unknown. In a relationship, when you two people start growing, there is no knowing where they end up. Sometimes you start off very far away from each other, and as you grow the relationship, you move towards a sense of oneness and unity. At other times, you start off very close with each other, and as the relationship goes, you go far apart, and you may end up in separation, divorce, or both. So there is, the destination is unknown. So it's not one point. There's tremendous ambiguity in relationships in terms of how you grow. So ambiguity tolerance is something that keeps our intelligence fresh. I also want to talk very briefly about the kinds of emotional patterns that often sabotage our intelligence. One of them is, you know, the panoptic gaze we've talked about. People have had expectations and fears about us that often take over and that prevent us from realizing our full potential. Somebody may have seen me as utterly incompetent, as a quote unquote loser. If I've internalized that gaze, the panoptic gaze of the caregiver, I will end up making that negative judgment about me a self-fulfilling prophecy at a deep level. And I'm going to get to Bruce in just a second. He has his hand up. But while I finish this sub-point, another one is emotional patterns that sabotage intelligence. So I was just trying to write down examples of those, and I got a handful. Some of us want to please other people, and earning the approval of other people is very important. You're actually listening to a webinar being delivered by somebody who falls into that category. So if I'm always into trying to please other people or please my boss, you can see that I might not search for deeper solutions. Others of us are afraid to assert ourselves. We fall into something called groupthink, where we are likely to conform to the consensus of our colleagues without actually striving to preserve our originality through more creatively intelligent solutions. Some of us lack self-confidence, and that could be a burden that we carry that prevents us from exercising the fullness of intelligence. So there are many things that happen. Before I get to Bruce, I just want to talk about Howard Gardner. Many of you might be familiar with Howard Gardner, who actually popularized the concept that there are 8 to 10 different kinds of intelligences. You know how people used to think of something called the G factor, which is general intelligence, which is measured by IQs. And Howard Gardner introduced us to 8 types of intelligence consisting of linguistic intelligence, logical, mathematical intelligence, spatial intelligence, bodily kinesthetic intelligence, musical intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, intrapersonal intelligence, which is like more intrapsychic intelligence about inner things that are going on in you and making sense of them, and naturalist intelligence with the outside world. So I want to pause, and Bruce has been very patient with us. Bruce, can you share with us your insight, my friend?
Hi, Param. Talking about destinations, you're in space on your way to the moon, you know the destination. But I would suggest that the destination in a relationship is well known. The destination is living happily ever after, you know, long walks on the beach, and you know, you're just always having a great time together, laughing and having fun, no friction ever. A total fantasy. But still, I believe that that's perceived to be the destination of a relationship.
Right. And also the journey. Ideally, that is both the journey and the destination. You know, if we can collapse the dichotomy.
So yeah, the idea that the destination in a relationship is unknown, you know, I agree that where it's going to end up is totally unknown.
Is unknown.
But
that's what I meant. Yeah, yeah.
But the destination that people are going for is happily ever after.
Right. But what that looks like for every person might be different, because if you actually check into people's subjective realities of what they're projecting as their fantasy, there are details that might be very different. Some people actually might prefer more creative tension in the relationship, which others would see as conflict and not conforming to the sense of happily ever after. So in principle, I agree with you. Yeah. But the point about the metaphor about the moon, going to the moon is like, at least you know where you're going and you're probably going to get there. Whereas with relationships, the ambiguity and uncertainty of how it'll evolve, and even if the destination is known, it might have a very circuitous route up through valleys and all of that, and others might be more linear. So all of that just adds to the mystery of relating.
Mystery for sure.
Mystery for sure. Yeah. Thank you, Bruce. I'm coming to the point where we are going to be concluding the seminar in just a few minutes, but it is very important to remember, and I want to quote Osho. He says, man is conscious that he's intelligent, and this consciousness brings its own problems because it creates ego. As ego becomes strong, it starts surrounding intelligence like a thick layer of darkness. Intelligence is light and ego is darkness. And that's true. So many of the things that happen, that blunt our intelligence seem to be as a result of our own ego. Because when we grow and develop our ego, we are so committed to being right in every argument, in every situation. We are so committed to control and domination. But intelligence requires a different kind of openness. Osho reminds us that when you become closed, you lose your intelligence. And he says intelligence requires the open sky, the sunlight and the wind, and it has to flow like a river. If it becomes stagnant, it becomes a dead phenomenon. So one of the challenges is that intelligent people are able to see the hypocrisy of society, the hypocrisy of social, political, and economic institutions. And they have to deal with all of these contradictions, right? But so society itself probably doesn't want you to be very intelligent, because intelligent people can be troublemakers. They can ask too many questions and they can disturb the status quo. So I want to change gears and then come to the conclusion. 2 points I want to leave you with. Osho reminds us of Nietzsche's metaphor of the journey. We are first camels. We accumulate a lot of knowledge and information that other people pass on to us. Then we evolve into a lion, where we start roaring and asserting ourselves, and our ego becomes big. And we no longer want to be taught by other people. We want to find our own voice and sing our own song. And you live for some years in the state of the lion, and then hopefully you will evolve again into being a child. Children, as Osho says, are not knowledgeable, but they're extremely intelligent. Society covers that intelligence with layers and layers of information. So I often notice when I teach a management class, the very first class before people have read the textbook, I ask people, what makes businesses successful? And I get so many creative answers. By the end of the last day, after people have mastered the textbook and passed all the exams, I ask them the same question, and I don't get people's original observations and thinking. I either have them repeating Michael Porter's model of competitive advantage, or C.K. Prahalad and Gary Hamel's model of core competence of the corporation. Their fresh thinking is replaced by memorization and knowledge. And that's one of the challenges. How do we rise above that? Osho's answer is simple. The whole function of meditation is to take you deeper into yourself. It is a method of digging into your own being to the point you come to the living waters of your own intelligence. So for mystics like Osho, intelligence is not synonymous with knowledge. You keep digging into your own being, get past the blind spots that prevent you from seeing, from relating, from being powerfully in the present. And if you can come to the place where you can live powerfully in the present, you are taking in reality at its full level of intensity. And you have come to the point where you can then discover or rediscover the living waters of your own personal intelligence. Man tries to repress rather than to understand, manipulate others rather than to relate, because even to relate to somebody requires a lot of understanding. And see how we often do stupid things by trying to manipulate people, sometimes even manipulate our significant others into control, dominance, and all of that. So the challenge then is to not fall into these suboptimal strategies and to really be able to discover, the flame within, the mirror that has been covered by dust, to wipe that clean. Thank you so much, folks. I want to pause and tell you, for those of you who are joining this webinar for the first time, I want to tell you how this goes. The first 30 minutes is a presentation, almost exclusively a presentation, a monologue that I do. And after the 30 minutes, we go into a little bit of discussion, storytelling, sharing from the audience. People sometimes ask questions, they share experiences that require no comments. And we stay together till, no more than 3 o'clock, but sometimes we even finish sooner. When there's a pause and there's a lull and it feels organically complete, we declare the webinar over. So please don't feel any pressure to stay with us beyond this point. If your cup is full and you're ready to leave, my gratitude to you. If you want to be placed on an email list, do email me and I will be happy to put you on the mailing list. If you wish to stay now, the microphones, you can unmute yourself. And I've just put my email for those of you who want to be on the email list for future Sunday webinars. They always go from 2 to 2:30. There's also a YouTube channel where previous ones are posted. So I'm going to stop the recording at this point.